Hey friends. Chapter 12, Section 2. This is the second video that chronicles our understanding of Native Americans before the time of Christopher Columbus. So the first video dealt with the Inca and the Andes Mountains. This video will deal with Native American groups that were in Mesoamerica, and then the final video will conclude with Native American groups that were in present-day United States and Canada. It's important to kind of remember that there were civilizations that existed down in Middle America, like the Aztec, and also with the Inca too. That's not going to be the case in the United States as much. So going on to Mesoamerica then too. Here's what the video will cover. I think studying especially the Aztec can kind of bring us and to a lot of these questions about a TED talk that I'll actually talk about at the very end of the story about the danger of a single story, because I think with the Aztecs and the Maya, we think of maybe their collapse, and then we think of their conquest. And I want to talk just a little bit about that at the very end of the video then too. And right away, we can kind of see from our text, I pulled this quote from my college text about how the history of these people is written. It says, Spanish conquerors obliterated both empires. That's referring to the Aztec and the Inca. But Native American traditions have endured, overlaid and combined with Hispanic culture to provide clues to their pre-Hispanic past. So this is telling us again, as historians, that there's going to be kind of an absence of that written text that makes writing histories so much easier than too. So going way back in history, here are the different Native American groups that had existed in Mesoamerica, and our text talks about one of the oldest groups were actually the Olmec, who lived in central Mexico and were famed for the creation of some of their giant heads. Olmec civilization likely lasted from 1200 BCE to 600. This is about the same time period as like the Minoans and the Mycenaeans in Greece, and going to about 600 BC is about right before the time of Rome. So they were one of the first groups to solidify control in the area of Mesoamerica then too. The video also, or the text also talks about a lot of other Native American groups that we don't have time to cover, but it's important to acknowledge Native Americans that lived at Teotihuacan, Tenochtitlan, here the Aztecs, but we also had like the Toltec. We also had other Native American groups who aren't mentioned in the text, but who will try to acknowledge them first. So the Maya mostly lived in the area of present-day Mexico, the Yucatan Peninsula, and then also part of Guatemala in the southern section then to here. Some of their famous cities were Chichen Itza. Also, you had Tikal, which I believe was the longest, or the greatest, or the largest Native American city that they had. Their notable attributes: their writing system was very elaborate. The Maya wrote down a lot, but unfortunately, a lot of it was lost with both the Maya collapse, which is what the next slide will talk about, and also too, the Maya wrote down their histories on parts of like wood and tablets that didn't survive. Some of the hieroglyphics do survive, and we're able to translate it and learn more about them, but we don't have as many resources to kind of reconstruct the history of the Maya people. It's incredible to acknowledge how the Maya were able to become stargazers and astronomers. They recognized Venus. They had two separate kinds of calendars. Their centuries were divided into 52 years, I think. But the Maya recognized Venus, and they knew about how the Earth moved around the sun then too, which gave them incredible power later on then too. This was the Maya elite then. Tikal, as a city here, had roughly 50 to 70,000 people. At the time, it was one of the largest cities in the world. And we know that there were 39 different rulers who presided during the Jaguar Paw dynasty as they consolidated their control in the Maya lowlands, the Yucatan Peninsula, and also other sections south here in Guatemala then too. Cancun is a very popular resort. A lot of my students actually go there. It's, I think, located here along the coast. Chichen Itza is just a day trip to go and see it, so that would be awesome. I have never been to this part of the world. I'm hoping to, though, at some point. Here is another illustration from my text that kind of gives us a insight into the hierarchy that exists in the Mayan civilization. The emperor was always at the top. We can see here he's centered at the very top of the fresco, and he's accompanied by his royal family, other priests, family members, and but it appears that he obviously is standing out with this elaborate headdress. In this case, they are captives being present to the Emperor Chan Muam, who is likely going to have them either sacrificed or later on, maybe they would play one of the Pak to Tak ball games then too. They're presented here, but then lower down on the reign will be the military leaders, oftentimes at the very bottom, the commoners too. So there was definitely a hierarchy in which the Mayan emperor was at the very top then too. And then we'll talk about the human sacrifice, the way the Maya and the Aztec practiced it then too. But the Mayan civilization began to collapse sometime around the 10th century. Historians aren't exactly sure why, but we do have a couple theories. If this is going to be Tikal, I used this illustration in class. One of the major factors was probably the slash and burn techniques that the Maya incorporated in the way that they basically depleted the soil and farm the same crop every year, maize mostly, but also beans, squash, tomatoes, chili peppers. And then basically, if this is the area where the farmers were, they have to take their supplies back to Tikal, but now this soil is worn out. So what they did is they went farther out. And what happens is when you go farther out, you have more land to farm, but then you have a longer route back to Tikal. And eventually, this soil is depleted already. This soil becomes depleted. You can do it again, but that commute is just getting longer and longer till eventually it just became so unsustainable that there was likely a shortage of food. This combined with war amongst rival groups, droughts, and famines. There's a lot of fascinating work being done. People who study the soil are able to tell how much rainfall in a particular area got 1,000 years ago, which is incredible to me then too. Um, so probably some kind of combination of all of these factors led to the Mayan demise sometime around the year 900. Maya still existed in subsets and clusters, like Chichen Itza was still a functioning Mayan city, but there was not the civilization that united large swaths of the Yucatan Peninsula. It's one of the great mysteries as to what actually caused it then too. This picture is behind it, but this is one of the earliest photographs of, I think this is Tikal. When it was discovered by archaeologists, we can just see how um, the the ruins are. It's covered in vines, and the jungle almost consumes this city, which has led historians to wonder lots of times about what actually caused the Maya just to leave their city. The Toltecs lived also for a while and exerted influence, but the other huge empire that existed would be the Aztecs, who controlled a swath of territory a bit farther north off of Lake Texcoco. Their capital was Tenochtitlan. I've also heard it pronounced Tenochtitlan, which I think is more closer to the Nahuatl, the language that the Aztecs used. I think Nahuatl was what the Aztecs used. Maybe that was the Maya. That could be wrong. Don't quote me on that. But notable attributes. We have this famous legend in 1325 how the Aztec were to travel until they found an eagle on a cactus with a snake in its mouth. And there they were to build their capital. Well, this happened to be right on Lake Texcoco, where the Aztecs built one of the largest cities in the world, Tenochtitlan. This is also represented on the Mexican flag, just like they're reflecting their culture, their history on the flag, just like this is Great Zimbabwe on this flag too. And it's interesting we can kind of connect this to our world too, because when the Spaniards conquer the Aztecs, they will take the buildings from Tenochtitlan and literally build Mexico City. But these Mexico City is like built on a lake, which they drained, but it still wouldn't be the greatest place to create a city. And Mexico City still has problems today with buildings that are sinking because they're not built on great infrastructure, which I think is just kind of interesting. We talked about the lake. The Aztecs, like the Romans, built canals and aqueducts to supply the city with farming, irrigation, and even indoor plumbing, then, too. Some wealthier Aztec members had that as a luxury. Different interpretations, different reasons for sacrificing, but the Aztecs practiced sacrifice on a scale much larger than any other Native American civilization, than, too. Quetzalcoatl was the sun god. The Mayans called him Kukulkan. And what the Maya and the Aztec believed was that the sun god required human blood to move across the sky each day, then, too. So captives would be taken to the tops of the pyramids where hundreds, thousands of people would be watching. The sacrifice would occur here, and then the heart would actually be put onto like a flaming cauldron, and the smoke would go up to the heavens, which would then feed the god. Look at that great drawing. That's the god. That's the cloud. Oh my goodness. Yeah. So yeah. But anyway, there are hieroglyphics that used to tell us about their way of life then too. But as we'll see, a lot of that history gets lost with the Spanish conquest then too. There was also that strict hierarchy amongst the people that existed. Oh, also with the Maya, you had the emperor who was already at top, followed by the royal family, nobles, priests, military leaders, soldiers, artisans. The majority of the people were at the bottom. They were the farmers then too, and also slaves were at the very bottom. Slaves would normally be captured Native Americans. Lots of times, the Tlaxcala was one of the groups that always resisted the Aztecs. And we conclude with the conquest of the Aztecs. Our text only talks about it for one quick second with the story of Hernan Cortes. We'll study that later on then too. But here's where I wanted to kind of talk about the stories and the histories that we have of the Aztecs then too. Why is like the story of the conquest always the dominant story? Most of the history that we have from the Aztecs comes from the stories told by the Spaniards. So, all of the written records, all of the primary sources that we can use to understand these people are written by a conquering force. And that's not going to give us the greatest picture of who the Aztecs really were, then, too. Aztec history was lost and destroyed in that aftermath. And even if we don't know it, I think it's important to acknowledge its presence. Even though we don't have as much, we don't know as much, we can still know that that history existed then too. I always forget to hide this thing. But here's what I wanted to bring up the TED Talk. What happens though if we tell ourselves the same story over and over and over about the history of the conquest of the Aztecs? Well, actually, here is Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. I hope I pronounced that right. I don't think I did. She writes in one of her famous TED Talks that if we create that single story, if we show a story of people as one thing, only one thing, over and over again, that is what they become. And the historical sources that we have talk about the Aztecs and their conquest then too. This is also from, again, my college textbook. We have information about the history and culture of the Aztecs and Inca that was told to the Spanish in the wake of these people. But these accounts are colored by the interests and prejudices of the conquerors. Long story short, then, the history that we have comes from the Spanish, and a lot of that is colored by, again, these prejudices that existed at the time then too. So then to conclude, I know this video went over 10 minutes, but I think thoughtful history should evoke lots of feelings. And in the case of the conquest of the Aztecs and the Maya and the history that was lost, I think there's a lot of sadness to think about when we study the whole chapter of the history of Native Americans before Christopher Columbus.